Hello guys, and welcome to another session of database. On this episode we'll be looking at the design of a database. Now let's proceed. The first thing we are going to look at is designing a database. How do we design a database? Now basically we design a database using a software that we call data modeler, right? Now we have another set of softwares that we use in designing a database, but let's design a database using the software that we call data modeler. Before then, we have to look at the business rules, the basic building blocks of a database. Okay, the first thing we're going to look at is a business rule. Now, what is a business rule? We say a business rule is a precise description of a policy within a specific organization. Now, for every good database developer, you will need what we call a business rule. What is a business rule? Now, for example, let's say I'm going to develop a database for a supermarket. Now, I will have to make inquiries on how the supermarket operates. Do they have customers? Do they have employees? How do they operate their business? Now, I will use the information I will gather to prepare or develop my database. For example, if I'm doing it for a school, I will have to ask questions on how they operate. Do they have students? Do they have teachers, staff? All these are the information I'm gathering, and that is what we term as what? The business rule. So you need to gather these series of information from an organization before you can develop a good database. The next thing that we are going to look at is the basic building blocks of a database. Now, before you can design a database, you will need these four building blocks. One is what we call an entity, an attribute, constraint, and then relationship. Let's look at the definition for these building blocks. An entity. So what is an entity? We say an entity is anything about which data could be stored. So for example, if we want to, after gathering my business rule information, now I want to store data on customers, right? Employees and students. Now the customers, employees, and then the students are what we call as an entity. So these are an example of what? Entities. So an entity can be a customer because I can store information about a customer, the location of the customer, the email address, the phone number. If I take an employee, the first name, the last name of an employee, the salary, a student's ID, the fees. So all these are known as the entity. The next building block is an attribute. What is an attribute? The attribute is basically the characteristics of an entity. An example of an attribute is the person's first name, the last name, address, the salary, and so on. So all these will come together to form an entity, and that makes it a characteristic. The next thing that we're looking at is a constraint. Now the constraints are set of data restrictions. So for example, if you go to the bank, mostly if you want to deposit money or withdraw an amount, they don't use your name, but you have to enter your account number. Now they enforce what we call a primary key constraint on all account numbers so that there wouldn't be duplication, because if I'm using account number 1 and then someone too is using the same account number 1, it will conflict. How are we going to deposit the amount? So that is why we need what? Constraints on data entries. And then we need another constraint that we call foreign keys to relate the entities, where we'll be looking at how to perform relationship. And then we have another one that we call a check constraint. For example, if the gender that we know basically is male and then female, so no one or no other end user should have an access of inserting in transgender. It's not accepted, so we can use what? The check constraint. And then we have not null constraint, and not null constraint which wouldn't accept empty values. And then we have a unique constraint which is also similar to a primary key. Then we have another building block that we call relationship. We say relationship is association among what? Entities, how to relate or perform or see the connectivity between two entities. Now we have three main types of relationship. That's what we call one-to-one, sorry, one to many, many to